Mankind has long been digging and indeed getting a hole that would be hard to get out of. After years of destruction and unfair treatment, Mother Nature is now fighting back. The result is deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, food shortages, and conflict. In our first episode of Surviving Climate Change, CGTN's Lindy Mtongana sets the pace by unpacking the realities of climate change.
It hurts.
Global warming, climate change and conservation, words that are more often said than acted upon by governments and leaders of the world. The truth is, climate change has been brought about by the greed that favors few but affects us all, and not just humans, the entire planet. If wild animals and plants had an enemy, it would probably be us humans. We need only look at the ways in which we've ravaged the earth to understand why. Here's some facts to help put this into perspective. Over the last century, the planet has warmed at a rate of 1 degree Celsius a year. Hard to notice as we go about our day-to-day lives, but over the past 5 years, temperatures have risen at record levels. The whole situation is linked to 3 human activities: the burning of fossil fuels, intensive farming, especially for meat and crop production, and deforestation. Here in Africa, extreme weather patterns are already wreaking havoc in many nations. In 2019 and much of 2020, parts of East and West Africa were hit by floods, leaving a trail of death and destruction. The region is also recovering from 2 devastating cyclones, which resulted in deaths and the displacement of thousands. The cyclones also destroyed crop production, leaving aid agencies to respond to multiple humanitarian crises.
The scars of Cyclone Idai are visible. However, authorities and aid workers believe that they have the cholera outbreak under control.
A desert locust invasion that started in the Horn of Africa has added to the region's woes. Crops that were planted by smallholder farmers have been destroyed by the pests. Meanwhile, weather experts have been predicting a drought on the heels of these floods. It seems when it rains, it pours in Africa. Even sunny spells are no longer normal. They're often searingly hot and accompanied by food and water shortages. This is climate change at play, and it's not just Africa. Asia, the Americas, and Europe have all found themselves at the deep end of climate change. Cyclones, heat waves, fires, and heavy rains are all becoming increasingly common. According to German infographics firm Statista, countries like China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India are among the world's most polluted. However, countries like Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Estonia are those considered least polluted. Here in Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt are among those whose pollution levels are most worrying. Although there have been efforts to contain the situation, lack of cooperation is seen as the biggest impediment. Some conservationists see climate conferences as little more than talk shops, all heat but no fire.
We're here to raise our voices. We know that climate change has already started and it's killing us.
While grandstanding marks this debate, coral reefs are disappearing and glaciers are melting, leading to rising sea levels. Despite Africa contributing the least to the world's greenhouse gas emissions, the continent is feeling the heat. Food production is being compromised as populations continue to expand. Forests are being cleared to create habitats, which feeds into an already complicated situation. This is conflict. For a long time, the Sahel region was a bedrock of symbiotic coexistence between herders and farmers. Farmers would allow their nomadic brothers and sisters to graze their livestock on their land and fertilize it for the next growing season. But years of unfavorable weather patterns led to cycles of poor harvests. With dwindling food production, a conflict ensued. This is what has been exploited by Al-Qaeda and ISIL to create a potent security threat. This has already claimed a regime in Mali and has influenced election outcomes in countries like Nigeria and Guinea-Bissau. We could list more and more climate change-related cases and incidents. However, this boils down to individuals and governments. Climate change poses a serious threat to the fundamental rights for all. It affects our access to food, to health, and compromises our quality of life for individuals and communities. It is thus our individual, national, and international responsibility to care for nature for us and future generations. The late Nobel laureate Professor Wangari Maathai once said, "Mother Nature is very generous, but also very unforgiving." The reality is, if you destroy nature, nature could destroy you. If we are not careful enough and responsible, this could be practical in our lifetime. It would appear it has already started happening.
Well, for more on issues of climate change, we're now joined by Dr. Richard Munang. He's an environmental and regional climate change coordinator at UNEP, which is based in Nairobi. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Doctor, what is the status of climate change? And by that, I just mean, like, specifically, what do you see different countries around the globe doing to be able to combat the effects that we're seeing of this global warming?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and discussing this very important subject, climate change. On what countries are doing across the world, let me put in perspective the science, which the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, released a report just a few weeks ago on the state of the global climate change, which shows that the world was actually currently, as we speak today, at 1.2 degrees. That's just 0.3 degrees shy away from the 1.5 degrees where the world actually is supposed to ensure that climate change, we don't go above that temperature to ensure irreversible damages in the planet. And that fits into the United Nations Environment emissions gap report that was released in December last year, which showed that currently the trajectory in which the world is moving, by the end of the century, the world will be above 3.2 degrees. So when you look at the science, it is pointing to the fact that we are heading above the 2 degrees and more so above the 1.5 degree. But what countries are doing across the world? It's eminent in the ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was adopted in December 2015. And countries have ratified this, especially the African region, where 52 African countries have actually ratified this, showing that they actually see the inherent and the opportunities when it comes to taking climate action. But that ambition needs to actually be increased to ensure that what the report and the science is telling us is actually something that needs more climate action ambition. Because still in the UNEP emissions gap report that was released in December, it shows that if the world was to focus on what is called the green pandemic recovery and implement actions that lowers emissions, but at the same time also drive socioeconomic opportunities, in 9 years from today, the world can be able to cut 25% of emissions and actually ensure that we can limit temperature below 2 degrees.
Doctor, speak to us about how Africa can play a part, or what you're seeing African countries doing, because one of the things that we've heard repeatedly is that while Africa, or our countries on the African continent, have some of the lowest emissions in terms of contributing to this climate change, a lot of the countries are the most affected. So what are you seeing African countries do to be able to contribute to that change that you're speaking about?
The continent of Africa is a leader. As I stated earlier, 52 out of the 54 African countries have ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And as we're speaking today, the continent and the entire world is doing what is called revising the national determined contributions, which are actually plans that countries put forward in December 2015. So they are revising this and increasing ambition. And actually, out of the 5 countries that have submitted this revised ambition, 2 of them in the continent have actually put ambitious ambition to be able to drive climate action. So when it comes to policy, Africa is a leader. But what needs to be done is that the policies need to be implemented, and that is where the glaring gap actually exists. So moving forward, countries need to actually start turning those policies and plans into actions, whereby the implementation of climate action become a socio-economic opportunity, where it's not only about reducing emissions, but in addition to reducing emissions, it's also helping to address socio-economic challenges of food insecurity, where we have 257 million people going to bed each and every night hungry, and leveraging on clean energy solutions, which are actually part and parcel of some of these plans called nationally determined contributions to add value to what is produced. And what is produced should be done in a way that works with nature, not against nature, using what is called ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. Because UNEP's adaptation gap report pointed out that if the world was able to build climate resilience by implementing the green pandemic recovery, leveraging on nature-based solutions like land restoration, the world could actually be able to limit economic damages as a result of climate events, whether we're talking about floods or whether we're talking about storms, limit that by about 1.6%. And if the world was to invest 800 million US dollars, can actually see a return of up to about 16 billion. So when it comes to the African region, implementation, taking into consideration climate action solutions of clean energy, adding value to what is produced, could actually create jobs, especially for the young people, and at the same time lower emissions, but lift people from the bottom of the pyramid. Because let's face it, we are talking post-COVID era, where most of the gains that have actually been accrued over the past 10 years in the continent, climate change is still playing a role, but at the same time, the COVID pandemic has actually weakened and reduced the economic opportunities and gains that have existed in the continent. So leveraging climate action post-COVID pandemic and implementing the solutions that are articulated in the UNEP emissions gap report of the green pandemic recovery.
Dr. Mnang, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for that. It was really good having you. Thank you for your input and your insight. Dr. Richard Mnang speaking to us, and he's based here in Nairobi.